here on a Thursday evening. But since by the end of the talk I hope to convince you that you had no choice but to be here, I don't see much point in it. Okay, so actually, why don't we leave the lights? Why don't we leave the lights out for this one? I'll tell you why in just a second. But there's not much photography or anything like that in here, so I think let me know if you have trouble seeing the screen, and we can turn the lights down. But if you can see okay, I'd rather have them up. You may question, given my introduction and so on, what are my credentials for giving a talk on scientific and philosophical perspectives on free will. And I'm very happy to present those. I don't have any. I have no formal educational background in that whatsoever, except for a few assorted courses I took as an undergraduate many years ago, and some books that I've read since then. So you may then be asking me, why are you giving this talk? Okay, and the reason is actually because of the last talk that I gave, and this is a slide from that talk. And about the middle of the talk, I posed this proposition. I said, mechanics reveals how we live our lives, eating, breathing, moving. But where we actually live most of our lives is in the subjective, perceptions, emotions, convictions, right? And so mechanics explains the subjective, right? So it can explain the emotions that you feel based on neurophysiology and neurochemistry. But it also explains it away. And then I pose the question, is the mechanics the meaning? Okay. And so I thought, well, this is really an interesting question. You know, I've thrown it up here, and I sort of alluded to an answer on a fairly general and subjective level, but I didn't really investigate it with any rigor. So I thought, you know, I ought to go out and learn more about this myself. And so I read several books on this topic, and what I'm presenting to you tonight is the opinions and findings of these authors of these books. They are certainly not my own. But I thought it would be, it's something that I think we don't think about very much in the ordinary course of our lives, although it's obviously very important. And so, even though I make no claim to be an expert on this at all, at least we could open up a discussion. So, for that reason, that's why I want to have the lights on here, right? And so, if rather than presenting this as a formal talk, which it's really not, if you have thoughts or questions as we go along, bring them up, and we can discuss them briefly. I'll just say we do want to try to get through with this in more or less an hour, so I may need to cut things off if we begin to go on very long, but we can carry that on afterwards in the discussion section. So the basic issue that is, let me go back here for a second to the previous slide. So back here, right, I have this little statement about how we can reduce our convictions and emotions to neurochemistry. And so what's the basis for that? Well, the basis is the idea that if the universe really consists fundamentally of atoms and energy, right, then it's the actions of these things that determine our behavior. They are the outcome of these processes that are happening at levels that we cannot perceive with our senses. So if that's the case, then we cannot, almost by definition, have anything that corresponds to free will. And so we can have sort of a hierarchy that I show down here, right? So here's what we'll consider, at least for the moment, to be the fundamental constituent of matter, atoms. And they're aggregated into molecules. And in organisms, or not even in organisms, atoms can organize, or molecules can organize themselves into unicellular organisms. And unicellular organisms can organize themselves into organisms, which possess within themselves organs. One of those organs is the brain, and the brain produces thoughts, and those are ultimately the outcome of what goes on at the bottom of the hierarchy. So the name for this approach to, or names for this approach to viewing the way that the universe works, one name is causal determinism. In other words, that the causes of things that are going on are determined at the lowest level. Or another one is atomist reductionism. In other words, we can reduce all of what we see and experience to the actions of atoms at the lowest level. And these are technical names for this kind of position. So, that is sort of the scientific basis for looking at the world in this way. This series is called Faith and Science, right? And so, obviously, I presume people who are here have an interest in the alternative way of viewing things, which would be through faith, or in my case certainly, and probably most of the people here at least, based on a biblical perspective of free will. Okay? And so we have our own convictions that are based on whatever religious viewpoint we come from. And so I would just like to ask the question to members of the audience who consider themselves to be Christian, whether they think that if someone were to completely convince you that you had no free will, would that affect your, would that be compatible with being a Christian? Let's put it that way. Okay? So let's get a show of hands here. How many people feel that lack of any free will would be compatible with being a Christian? Raise your hand if you do. Well, that's pretty uniform response. How many people feel that it would be completely incompatible?
Rephrase it again.
What?
What's the question again?
Well, the question is that if you were convinced that there was no such thing as free will, that causal determinism was the basis for your actions and decisions, right? Would you feel that that was incompatible with being a Christian? Okay, so go ahead now, everybody else. Okay, so we got a lot of people, I don't know, I didn't count them, but there's a whole bunch of people out there that raised their hands for no, basically, and nobody raised their hands that they felt it was compatible. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the things that are actually in the Bible that bear on this. So I put up a selection of quotes from here, going from the beginnings of the Old Testament to the New Testament. So, for example, we have Joshua 24, and here it says, "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the ancestors your gods served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord," right? So, obviously, in this passage, the key word here, right, is this one right there, choose. So, the whole passage does not make much sense, does it, if people do not have the ability to freely choose what God they are going to worship. If their choice of a God was predetermined by physical events and heredity and so on, then the statement is meaningless. Okay? We can look at this one from Ezekiel. "Say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live." Turn from your evil ways. Why will you die, people of Israel? There's no point in that statement, is there, unless people have the capacity to freely turn from their evil ways. John, now we move to the New Testament, the words of Jesus in John. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people chose darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Again, the operative word is chose. What sense does this make unless people have the capacity to choose? And finally, in Revelation, here I am, stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me. Right? So, if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, right? Again, he's offering a choice that is not meaningful unless people have the free will to choose or not. So from these verses at least, one can make a good argument that it would be incompatible with Christianity to maintain that humans do not have free will. However, we can look at some alternative passages here. Here is one from Exodus. He says, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you." Does Pharaoh have a choice here? No, obviously not. Pharaoh has no choice. And what are the consequences of this? That he is going to lay his hand on Egypt. That means bang, right? "And with mighty acts of judgment I will bring out my people." Okay, so at least in this particular context, it doesn't seem like Pharaoh has much choice. Here is one from Isaiah. "Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?' And I said, 'Here am I, send me.' He said, 'Go and tell this people, be hearing but never understanding, be ever seeing but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people callous, make their ears dull and close their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed.'" And Isaiah says, "Well, how long? How long is this going to go on?" He says, "Until the cities lie ruined and desolate, until the Lord has sent everyone far away and the land is utterly forsaken." So here, maybe there's the possibility that the people would hear and understand and of their own choice turn and repent. But he says, no, you're going to, through God's power, you're going to make their hearts calloused and their eyes blind so that they are not able to make a choice. And finally here we can come to, you may say, well, that's all Old Testament stuff. But what about the New Testament here? Romans. So Paul says, "What then shall we say? Is God unjust?" And what he's saying is that God has ordained that the Jews will not turn to Christ. Okay? And he says, "What then shall we say? Is God unjust? Not at all. For he says to Moses, 'I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion.' Therefore, God has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, and he hardens whom he wants to harden." Referring back to Pharaoh, right, and his heart being hardened. "One of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? For who is able to resist his will? But who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, 'Why did you make me like this?' Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for a wedding vase and some for a toilet bowl?" I actually paraphrased this last one. So in this passage, he says, okay, God destines some people to be wedding vases and other ones, they're going to go to a bad place, right? And that's the way that it is. And how dare you talk back to God if you don't like that? So, from these passages, one could take quite the contrary position. That in fact it's very compatible with being a Christian to say, yes, all these things are determined. Your behavior, your belief, your faith, all of that stuff is determined. And from the more scientific perspective back there, we can say, well, it's due to things in the environment, it's due to physical events, it's due to genetics and heredity and so on. And that's what produces this response that you don't have any control over. From a more religious perspective, you might say, well, it's God's will and it's God's sovereignty, but nevertheless, that's the way it ends up. Okay, so my conclusion from looking back at the Bible and trying to deal with the issue of free will in the Bible is that it really, you can have it either way, right? We had a very important foundational theologian who emphasized, for whom actually this particular passage was the heart, or at least a very central part of what he taught. And who was that?
Martin Luther?
Well, not so much Luther, no, really. Calvin. It was Calvin, right? And so this particular theological approach is very fundamental Calvinism. So my conclusion is that at the end of my talk today, you become convinced that in fact determinism is correct, you have no free will, and the things that you believe, you are determined to believe. You don't have to stop going to church. You just need to start going to that little church beside the library on McCutcheon Street.
Masonic Temple?
Presbyterian.
Frog library.
Okay, so we've looked at this a little bit from the scientific perspective and a little bit from the religious perspective. Let's look at it from the philosophical perspective. So this problem is most certainly not a new one. The ancient Greeks debated it vigorously. And one of the key elements in that is still enormously influential in philosophical debate today is Aristotle. And his statement here, nothing can be the cause of itself. So if that is the case, we, our minds, our brains, cannot be the cause of our actions, right? Our actions have to come from lower levels to higher ones, not causing itself, right? That was one of Aristotle's fundamental principles, and it is still, I certainly wouldn't say that that's universally accepted in philosophy today, but it's still very influential. So we have these types of arguments that were used in the ancient world versus what really amounts to a common sense evaluation. It's very difficult to convince yourself that you don't have the capacity for free will, right? Think about it. There's a lot of paradoxes that begin to arise if you try to do that. So, the philosophy of free will is very well established. The framework of it has been established for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it can sort of be summed up in this diagram here, where we have two positions about determinism. Physical determinism is true and physical determinism is false, right? And we have two philosophical positions about free will. Free will is impossible and free will is possible. And depending on where you fall in this matrix, you can apply one of these labels to your philosophical position. Okay? And this is something that's covered in courses on philosophy, but up until maybe the last 20 or 30 years, this was pretty much considered to be a moribund field. People not many philosophers worked in it, and not many philosophers paid much attention to it. And the reason was that all the arguments had been retread and retread over and over again until it was just repeating the same old stuff. And to try to boil it down very, very quickly to its essence, the people that are on this side here, right, this position said, look, we know that causes flow from the basic level upward through the hierarchy, and we know that this applies to everything in the world. Why shouldn't it apply to human beings? Is there any reason that human beings are an exception, sort of a miraculous exception to this rule? If we look at a piece of rock that falls off of the top of the cliff in Box Canyon, do we need to ascribe some higher level origin to the things that go on there? No. We have gravitation, we have the resistance of the atmosphere, we have interactions between atoms and molecules and physical forces and all this stuff. And we can explain everything completely adequately that way. Why should human beings be any different? To which the people that are on this side right here said, you know, look, it really raises a huge number of paradoxes that you can't really deal with if you say that people don't have free will and or moral responsibility. These problems are both social problems, right? If we say people don't have moral responsibility, then sort of the fabric of society disintegrates. And if we say people don't have free will, you begin to get into, you know, how do you choose that position, right? I assert, based on rational argument, that you do not have free will. Well, that is an inherent contradiction in itself. If you don't have free will, I don't have free will, and I'm not making that assertion of my own free will, am I? So, you know, so it's like, okay, you know, the old question about, you know, can an irresistible force move an immovable object? It's not, there's not much behind it. So philosophers kind of drop the whole thing. However, there's been a revival of interest in the last 20 or 30 years. And the reason is because of modern neurobiology. And we can really literally get inside of people's heads and see what's going on as they're thinking. And so that's sort of moved the whole level of mental processes from complete theorizing to some sort of actual physical basis. So with that introduction, basically what I'm going to talk about tonight is based on 3 books that I read. That's the sole basis of my authority in this. So the first one is this one right here. It's called Mind and Cosmos by a philosopher named Thomas Nagel. And the subtitle of the book is Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. A rather provocative subtitle. The second book, these are in the order I'm going to discuss them, is a very slim, small, light little book called Free Will by Sam Harris, who is both some sort, he has, does he really have 2 PhDs? It's something like that. Let me see here. He received a degree in philosophy from Stanford University and a PhD in neuroscience from UCLA. So, there you are. You could be more qualified. And finally, this book, Did My Neurons Make Me Do It? Okay, the ultimate excuse. Philosophical and neurobiological perspectives on moral responsibility and free will. And unlike Sam Harris, they did not combine both fields of expertise in one individual. So Nancy Murphy is professor of Christian philosophy at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, which is where Deb happens to be at the moment. And Warren S. Brown is professor of psychology at Fuller Graduate School of Psychology, Pasadena, California. So the authors are each experts in the philosophical and the neurobiological approach to human consciousness. So the one I'm going to start out with is Mind and Cosmos. And the reason is that I felt that it was actually least pertinent to the topic that we're talking about here. It's quite an interesting book. It's very elegantly written and it's elegantly argued. Well, you'll see why in my evaluation a little later on. I didn't consider it central. It's essentially a philosophical essay. Nagel is a philosopher. He does not claim to have any particular expertise in science. So I'll read this as his objective of the book. My target is a comprehensive speculative world picture that is reached by extrapolation from some of the discoveries of biology, chemistry, and physics. A particular naturalistic Weltanschauung that postulates... My wife will explain
Need
that
someone
word
to speak German there for you.
You can...
Weltanschauung.
Okay, which means...
Worldview.
Yes. that postulates a hierarchical relation among the subjects of those sciences and the completeness in principle of everything in the universe through their unification. So that's pretty ambitious. So here is his basis for writing the book. He says, it is prima facie highly implausible that life as we know it is the result of a sequence of physical accidents together with the mechanism of natural selection. So he is talking about the conventional geological evolutionary biology origin of organisms. We are expected to abandon this naive response, by which he means his own response as a philosopher, that he is skeptical about it, not in favor of a fully worked out explanation, in other words, something that you can really get your hands on, but in favor of an alternative that is really a schema for explanation supported by some examples. And obviously we don't have the time to go into this in detail, but the primary example of this that he gives is the origin of life itself, right? He says we have no definitive account of the origin of life. You're just expected to believe that molecules and things came together in some primordial soup in some hot spring or whatever, and cells came out of that, you know? And so we got some biochemistry and so on to kind of suggest that that could happen, but certainly no one has ever replicated it, etc. So he says, you know, okay, if you want to accept it, it's okay, but personally, I just find it totally implausible. What is needed? A satisfying explanation would show that the realization of these possibilities was not vanishingly improbable, which is what he believes, but a significant likelihood given the laws of nature and the composition of the universe. And this is really critical to him, it would reveal mind and reason as basic aspects of a non-materialistic natural order. And so for him, even more than the origin of life, the advent of objective consciousness is something that he does not feel can possibly be explained by natural processes. So he says, you know, it would reveal mind and reason to be basic aspects of reality, not just some accident that happened out, you know, at some corner of the universe by God knows what means, but as a basic aspect of the natural order. So here's his thesis. The great cognitive shift is an expansion of consciousness from the perspectival form contained in the lives of particular creatures, in other words, a fish sees a little fish it could eat or whatever, to an objective world-encompassing form that exists both individually and intersubjectively. It was originally a biological evolutionary process, and our species has become a collective cultural process as well. Now here's, each of our lives is part of the lengthy process of the universe gradually waking up and becoming aware of itself. So, this is almost a pantheistic type of approach, except that he is avowedly an atheist. And he discusses that repeatedly in the course of the book. So he thinks that this is just a fundamental nature of the universe that is becoming manifest through our consciousness. And that the universe was sort of designed all along, not by a deistic designer, but by an inherent nature to produce consciousness in the end. So, what about free will, the topic that we're here for? He specifically addresses that. I believe that and this is referring to some paragraphs before, in which he says that humans are motivated to act by perceptions of values, and he considers that extremely important. He says this motivation by perceived values involves a conscious control of action that cannot be analyzed as physical causation, with an epiphenomenal conscious accompaniment, I misspelled that, and that it includes some form of free will, although it is, as always, very obscure what sense to give to that motion. So clearly, if the universe itself is the origin of consciousness, right, and that's the purpose of and he is explicitly teleological, that's the purpose of existence, then that consciousness should have the ability to make meaningful choices. It would be very contradictory if it were not. So, from a very fundamental basis, he supports the idea of free will as an outcome of the nature of the universe. Yes?
I commend you getting as far as page 113.
Maybe he skips.
Okay, so, my evaluation of this book. It was very stimulating and thought-provoking. It was fairly... It's not a really dense, analytic philosophy book, which I really probably couldn't get through. But it was not easy. I mean, it's written at a very high level. But it is, big picture and stimulating. However, the author really does not, in my opinion, present any strong evidence that life and consciousness cannot arise from material causes. He argues that, but it's very qualitative, hand-wavy arguments. And so, I don't know. Maybe they're good, maybe they're not.
Just as a question, if he's saying that, what is he saying are non-material causes? I mean, he's saying that it's not a deity.
Right.
He's saying it's not material causes. But if it's not a deistic material cause, wouldn't you call just a natural aspect of the universe still a material cause? I just don't understand, what does he mean by,
Well,
what is he saying it actually arises from?
In some sense, he thinks that consciousness is inherent in the nature of the universe without there being a deistic origin for that. And he's very non-specific about how that would come about, okay, or what the real meaning of that is, okay? And so, that brings me down to my last line here. It's extremely speculative, and he presents arguments against the general issue of things, but on a very, very qualitative basis. And then he says there has, this capacity or drive toward consciousness is present, but he does not specify in any particular way how that would work. He has no mechanism. And so in my opinion, it was way too speculative to base any firm opinion regarding free will on. I didn't feel like, it gave you some suggestions or thoughts, but it didn't really go very far. So, that moves us on then to our second book here, Free Will by Sam Harris. And as you can see, it has that's notes. 65 very small pages with large print and lots of spaces between the lines. Very nicely bound with, the sort of rough cut paper on the edge here. And so, he has clearly aimed it at a popular audience. So it is by far the easiest of the three books that I'm talking about tonight to read. And he tries to boil down his position on free will into a minimum amount of page space and so on. And so as a result, it is very provocative. It gets its message across with a lot of punch and a minimum of technical verbiage. Okay? So here is his thesis. Free will is an illusion. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. Either our wills are determined by prior causes, by which he means three things. Genetics, environment, experience and environment, and possibly chance through things like cosmic rays, say, hitting a neuron in your brain or something like that. So either our wills are determined by prior causes and we are not responsible for them, or they are the product of chance and we are not responsible for them. There you are.
It sounds a lot like B.F. Skinner and freedom and dignity.
Okay, I think there is indeed a lot of similarity. The popular conception of free will seems to rest on two assumptions. Number one, that each of us could have behaved differently than we did in the past, so that you had the choice to behave differently than you did, right? And I think we would all agree that, if we don't have the choice to behave differently than we did, then we don't have free will. Secondly, that we are the conscious source of most of our thoughts and actions in the present. As we are about to see, however, both of those assumptions are false, right? So this, in my mind, is a little bit like Nurse Ratched, right? How do we feel this morning, right? We are not going to object to this injection, are we? So it's kind of a royal we. He gives some examples or things that he thinks demonstrate the falsity of these assumptions. So the falsity of assumption one, which is that each of us could have behaved differently than we did in the past. And he has this quote. But before I read the quote, I give you the background on it. What he's referring to, as sickening as I find their behavior. He starts out the book with an incident which occurred somewhere in the Northeast, Boston or somewhere, within the last decade, in which two burglars invaded a home, and they didn't expect, they thought the home would be empty, but it turned out there was a whole family of four that was asleep in the home. And so these people they had a lot of nasty stuff in their background, but they really weren't violent criminals. But one of them took a baseball bat and almost beat the husband to death. And then the other one raped the wife and then strangled her. And then they sexually abused the two daughters and then burned them to death. So that's the sickening behavior that he's talking about. Okay? As sickening as I find their behavior, I have to admit that if I were to trade places with one of these men, atom for atom, I would be him. There is no extra part of me that could decide to see the world differently or to resist the impulse to victimize other people. Okay, so this is his saying that we really couldn't behave, at any instant we couldn't behave differently than we are going to behave in the next instant. Okay, assumption number two, which is that we are the conscious source of most of our thoughts and actions. And he cites some neuropsychological experiments here in which people basically did things like PET scans, right, positron emission scans on brains. And so you can give some sort of stimulus or whatever to people, and then this will show where activity is happening in different regions of the brain. And so people, psychologists like to do these experiments where people have to make decisions and then they see what happens in their brain. And so here's the results of those. The physiologist Benjamin Lebet famously used EEG to show that activity in the brain's motor cortex can be detected some 300 milliseconds before a person feels that he has decided to move. So they do an experiment and they say, move your hand, and they're looking at a clock or something like that. And so they report when they decided to move, and this says that 300 milliseconds before they report that they decided to move, their brain actually showed something that consistently indicated that they were going to move.
You could also say that there's a will or spirit that the brain responds to.
Okay. Okay, one could.
That's how for the
In another experiment, researchers found two brain regions that contained information about which buttons subjects would press a full 7 to 10 seconds before the decision was consciously made. Now that is impressive. More recently, direct recordings from the cortex showed that the activity of merely 256 neurons was sufficient to predict with 80% accuracy a person's decision to move 700 milliseconds before he had become aware of it. So, it seems like, he lays great emphasis on this evidence. Seems like if somebody can look inside your brain and see the activity that's going on, they're going to know the next thing that you're going to do even before you consciously think of it. If that's the case, how can you possibly have free will?
These would be very difficult experiments to conduct.
Well, I agree, but they have been conducted and subject to peer review and all that, so.
It's just a line of transduction. And, you know, where does the origin of a signal or the information come from? You know, he's questioning that. Well, it's got to come from somewhere.
Okay. Good point. That's a very good point. But let's look at assumption 1 first, and we'll come back to that. Okay? Here's my criticisms of his fundamental positions in this book. And under assumption 1, that we don't have any choice but to, well, that we did not have the choice to do something different at any instant in time. His example, if I were transmuted atom for atom into this criminal the instant that he was going to commit his crime, I wouldn't be able to do anything different, right? Well, that's, yes, that's true. It's undoubtedly true, right? But it's really equivalent to the following statement. If events were exactly to repeat themselves, could they not repeat themselves? That's not really exactly the question about free will, right? Free will is about making decisions within some kind of context, not a physical instantaneous event being somehow different if it were to happen a second time. So I don't really see it as very pertinent at all to the issue of free will. And I'll come back to this a little bit later when I talk about the next book. So, now coming to your point here, Cindy, assumption 2 has an implicit, his refutation of assumption 2 has an implicit assumption. And that assumption is that the brain functions basically instantaneously. Okay? And this seems very implausible to me. Physical processes take some time to happen. How many processes do we know of that happen instantaneously? Maybe at the microscopic, the atom level, they do, for practical purposes, happen instantaneously. But in terms of macroscopic processes, it takes time for things to happen. And it takes time for I don't see that there's any fundamental argument that says that cognitive processes in the brain are instantaneous, right? And furthermore, it takes time for the manifestation of those processes to work through the system so that in some way you can report that you have had a thought. So in this famous experiment where there was reported to be a 300 millisecond delay in whether, between people deciding to push a button and the thought, the conscious manifestation of that, what they actually had them do was look at two numbers that were, like flashing on a digital display simultaneously, right? And so they had to report what two numbers they saw when they decided to push the button. And you try and mentally repeat this. Just imagine it. I did this myself. I said, okay, I'm going to sit here and close my eyes. I'm actually doing this. What's involved in that? You have to focus on these numbers. You have to make sure that you know exactly what numbers are up at all time. And then at some point you say, okay, I'm going to push the button, right? But at the same time, you're saying, what are the two numbers that are up there? And if it were me, I'd say, okay, I'm going to push the button. Oh, it's 7 and 2, right? Bing. And meanwhile, 300 milliseconds would have passed. Does that prove that it wasn't a conscious decision? I don't think so.
That's the propagation delay of the neuron down the arm.
Yeah. Not only to mention the processing delay in the brain from this business of memorizing numbers at the same
That's true,
time.
but they're using the time to push the button, which has a finite delay in the propagation.
Okay. So there's a bunch of physiological and cognitive processes that have to be accomplished, and I don't think that it's a very strong argument. Okay. However, my major criticism of the book is that these words that I have listed up here never appear, right? Dynamical system, feedback loop, emergence, right? These, you never see these words. And I mean, these, you know, I'm a hydrologist, and we deal with systems that are vastly less complex than the human brain. But we really wouldn't think about trying to deal with high-level hydrological system responses without talking about these types of things. Okay? So these are ideas that we've discussed for roughly the last half of the 20th century and the 21st century. So, in my opinion, Harris's scientific perspective in this book basically reflects that of the late 19th century. It's not at all an up-to-date, fundamental scientific perspective. So, this, I think, very accurately reflects the perspective that Harris is approaching it from. And this quote says, "An intellect which, at a certain moment, would know all the forces that set nature in motion, and all positions of all items of which nature is composed." So, for example, if you could have a record at a very early stage of the Big Bang of where all of the particles in the universe were, and what their energies and trajectories were, right? If this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. Okay? So, that's saying if I had this picture of everything that went on, you know, at the moment of the Big Bang, and I had the giant computer that could process it all, right, then I would know that 17 billion years later, this room would be constructed, and Shirley would be in it, and she would be thinking, what were you thinking when you read that book?
I was noticing what the quote was from.
Okay, that's right. So she would be, you would know that Shirley would be thinking, aha, Pierre Simon Laplace, right? And to me, well, that's a little dubious. This does indeed come from Laplace in an essay that he published in 1814. So, this isn't a position that most physical scientists, I think, would embrace today. Certainly in hydrology, and I think in other physical sciences as well, you know, we recognize complex systems operate through feedback loops, and these create nonlinear responses. And the result of these nonlinear responses and feedbacks is dynamical systems that are not inherently predictable at a fine level of detail. And sometimes they never respond twice in the same way to exactly the same forcing. Okay? And if these systems are complex enough, emergent behavior that you could not predict from all of the individual parts, comes out of the system. Okay, and there was an interesting one that Tom was talking about at the very beginning, before we started here. We were talking about bees and how they pick out a site for a hive. And I think that's a good example of emergent behavior. Okay, so any thoughts on Sam Harris before we go on?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I had more of a question. Did he explicitly say what his views are, what his creationist, evolutionist, or what he was?
Well, he is, you may be able to get a hint of his views from his previous New York Times bestseller, The End of Faith.
Also, if you throw quantum mechanics into it, it gets really interesting.
That's right. So you know, it is generally accepted, I believe, that quantum mechanics predictions are inherently indeterminate, right? And so he doesn't really discuss that at all. Well, he does a little bit, I guess. Whether that directly affects macroscopic systems is hard to say. Okay, so let's move on to the third book. Did My Neurons Make Me Do It? Which is a quite thick book, 334 pages to the very end, and is written at a fairly high level. It's very well written. It's actually, the writing is very clear and very concise and communicates things very well. But it is written by a PhD in philosophy and a PhD in neuropsychology, and they're both sort of writing at their, you know, level. And it's actually co-written. You can't tell what's written by who. So I found it very challenging to read. It was several times I read a chapter, and then the next evening I sat down to read the next one. I said, you know, I think I'll go back and reread the one I just did, because I don't think I really understood it. But it was, in my opinion, it was by far the best of the three books that I read, and I found it very rewarding. Okay, so here's how they start out. This is actually the first sentence in the book. It is an interesting fact about contemporary Westerners that we have no shared account of the nature of the human person. Even more interesting is the fact that many are unaware of the first fact. So think about it. What is the human person? What's the essence of it? So, sort of an answer to part of your question here earlier regarding Harris, what is their viewpoint? They ascribe to physicalism as opposed to dualism. Dualism would be the idea that there is some spiritual or non-material portion that resides inside of you and is the real person, right? Whereas, so this was expressed somewhat derisively by a biologist named Bryson, or philosopher, I'm not sure which, who described it as the ghost in the machine, right? The body is the machine, and then there's this non-physical part that is inside of there, the Descartesian soul or mind. Okay? So they ascribe to physicalism, and here's what their definition is. We take it to mean simply the denial that anything needs to be added to the living human body to constitute a human being. So, their motivating question is, if humans are physical systems, and if it is their brains, not their minds, i.e. their souls, that allow them to think, how can it not be the case that all their thoughts and behaviors are simply the product of the laws of neurobiology? Okay. So this is essentially the reverse of Sam Harris. Sam Harris would answer in the affirmative. He would say, yes, you know, it's impossible that it be otherwise. They don't agree. So their other goal, or another expression, our goal here is not to argue that humans are rational or responsible. Let me read that again. I don't think I read it very well. Our goal here is not to argue that humans are rational and responsible. In other words, they do think they are. We could not make sense of what we are doing in writing this book if we did not assume common sense views of the role of reason and reasons. That is, of our having good reasons for writing it, and of our readers accepting our conclusions on the basis of reason. And this is very early, page 3 in the book. And I love this, because when I read Sam Harris's book, my gut reaction was, well, why the hell did you bother to write this book if you don't believe that the people who are reading it do not have the capacity to make a rational decision to accept it? Right? They don't have the free will to decide whether they're going to, accept this as meaningful or not. So why did you write it? And here they say, okay, yeah, that's exactly right. So we're not going to start out by trying to argue something contrary to that. Rather, we hope to show how our neurobiological equipment makes rationality, responsibility, and free will possible. So they start out just as emphatically as Harris does. One goal of this book is defeat of causal reductionism, which I already defined. That is, we need to show that there are systems that act as causes in their own right. Who are they referring to here? Aristotle, right? A thing cannot be the cause of itself. They're saying Aristotle is wrong. Not merely as an aggregate of micro-level causal processes. We shall argue that this top-down causation functions by means of constraining the behavior of its parts. This would be common sense were it not for philosophers having convinced us that all causal work must be done at the subatomic level. Okay, so what about free will? Free will is obviously very central to this book. Free will we interpret as a matter of an agent's capacity as a dynamic system to redesign her own character through many instances of responsible action. So, they, right here again, early in the book, they bring in the human brain as a dynamic system. And this is the part I really like. This aims directly at, Harris's book was written after theirs, so it isn't direct, but nevertheless it bears directly on Harris's first argument, that if he were transmuted into this criminal at the instant of his criminal action, he couldn't do anything different. Yes, that's almost tautologically true. But what they're saying here is that suppose you were transmuted into that criminal a day before they did the activity, or a week, or a month, right? Different decisions might be made, and those different decisions might lead to different paths of action. Those might change the character of the person that's involved, and when they got into that situation in which they committed those crimes, they might have done something very different than they did in the case.
Yeah, but doesn't that just lead you right back into cause?
How so?
Well, every action has a cause, and so they're transporting themselves into a different environment. It's a different cause, and therefore they act differently.
Well, all I'm saying is that the outcome of a particular cognitive process does not always have to be the same. It's not determined by the individual lower level constituents. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a second here, so maybe it'll address your concern. So, how does it work, right? And that's really the heart of this book. That's like, the middle section this thick. And I don't have time to get into it all. It's extremely complex. They go through it in an extremely methodical and systematic fashion. And they start out with inanimate dynamical systems, and then they talk about ants as an example of dynamical systems at a much lower level than human organisms. And then they go into the human brain, and they develop a theory that's a very comprehensive and seems to me, at any rate, not being a person in that field, to be a very defensible theory. And the way they basically do it, I'm just going to sum it up with these figures. So they have an extremely simple kind of a reaction processing network here, where you have an impulse that comes in at this point in the system. It goes into R is the receptor, right? And then C is a comparator, and then depending on what happens, so it's a feedback loop that might be something on the level of a thermostat, right? And then they go into more and more complex feedback loops, and I'm certainly not going to try and explain this one, but basically what we see here is that we have one level of feedback here, and then we have a higher level of feedback here, and another level of feedback here, and finally another level up here that exerts an additional control on that. And so they say that the way that the human brain works is through cognitive feedback loops, and it's constantly getting sensory input from the environment around it. It compares that against all of the sort of parameters of action and response and so on that it has. It reevaluates that. It takes action, right? And then it sees what the response to that action is, and that goes into more feedback loops. And so through this process of repeated reflection and feedback, we can end up with decisions that are based on rational evaluation of what is around us and what the logical courses of action really are. And we can correct ourselves if we end up taking courses of action that are negative or irrational. So, here's their final speculation in the book. They say, so the basic causal structure of the universe, all the way, that should be from the bottom to the top, may be a dynamic interplay of downward causation from large webs of structures that have evolved over time, with bottom-up constraints provided by the original lower-level constituents. Science has attempted, and often succeeded, in capturing the laws governing lower levels by sealing off simple systems from interactions with their environments. But this may in fact have resulted in a false conception of the very nature of reality. And I thought this quote was particularly interesting because it tied back into Nagel's book and his thesis, right? And whereas he was approaching it from a philosophical perspective and was very lacking in any kind of mechanistic basis for what he described, their very thorough and detailed documentation of how these feedback loops can produce this kind of thing actually maybe supports Nagel's thesis. I'm not sure it really does, but they're kind of suggesting that at any rate, and I thought it was an interesting speculation. So they end up their book with some practical, and that's another aspect of it that I really liked. They ended it up with some practical suggestions for things that make one more human. In other words, more able to exercise free will and responsibility. And I'll just try to summarize these really rapidly. One is to teach children to ask themselves why they are doing what they're doing. Teach them language for evaluating their actions and motives. A second one is go meta regularly. Remember the value of self-reflection. Through literature, discussion, psychotherapy, and so forth, explore a broader possibility of ranges for thought and action. Number 3, it is harder to teach old dogs new tricks. It often takes a crisis. Nevertheless, in times of crisis, look for opportunities for a salutary reordering of the dynamic topography of motivations. In legal and moral matters, remember that there is no such thing as total freedom. All human action is conditioned to a greater or lesser degree by both biology and environment. So they admit the role of these factors in governing our behavior. At the same time, for complex self-determining systems such as human beings, there is no thing such as total biological determination. Neurons do not do things. You do whatever you do. Juries of our peers are pretty good at sorting out degrees of responsibility. Number 6, because freedom is limited, take advantage of limited opportunities to increase freedom later, or decrease it. Tie yourself to the mast when you are approaching the sirens. And finally, last one, go meta-meta. Reflect regularly on the extent to which you are employing these strategies to increase the range of your own and your children's freedom, self-understanding, and ability to make fair judgments of others. So with that, I'll end my talk.
So if you have questions, go ahead.
Now, I was reading a study a couple of years ago where these neurobiologists and such were getting together, working on basically it was the question of free will, but found in their study was consciousness appears to exist outside of the brain. Because, you can have one guy missing one half the brain, another guy missing another half, so on and so forth, different levels of destruction, and yet all of these people remain conscious. Therefore, shouldn't that also relate to the object of free will? If your consciousness is not, neurological, could not free will also be?
I guess my reaction, and again without much expertise, would be to question whether those experiments really indicate that consciousness is not physiological. If you can produce someone without any brain that still has consciousness, that would indeed make the case. But yes, people do seem to be able to function at least to a limited extent and have some form of consciousness with large parts of their brain gone. But I think that is more a result of the adaptability of the brain and its ability to restore functions even under severe trauma than it is of any non-physical form of consciousness.
I think if you think of consciousness as a process and not a thing,
right,
you can work your way through some of these things.
That's right, but presumably it's a process that's happening in the cells of the brain, right? Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, I find their model of action also reductionist.
Mhm.
Because, again, it's environment or your own thoughts. Even they recommend, meta. They don't also have that Christian understanding, maybe something larger than ourselves, like the Holy Spirit and prayer, other things that we can't measure coming within and that can influence our actions. As Christians, we believe that God can teach us, and there's nothing in there that, allows for something outside our experience or repeated decisions.
Okay, well that's certainly a very, very interesting question, and it's one that I think about quite a bit, and that I don't feel like I really have any satisfactory answer to. However, I think that their book is addressed to the issue of how consciousness and free will can be exercised in what we might call the ordinary environment, right? So I don't think that they're dealing with the spiritual experiences. They're saying, if you get angry at somebody and you decide not to hit them, right, is that a result of a responsible decision of free will, or is it a mechanical reaction that's determined by things that you have no control over, as Harris would say? So I think that what you're talking is sort of out of the scope of their book.
Well, except for that example. Okay, maybe it is, but I'm just saying a third option would be, is there conscience? Is there, the Holy Spirit
Right.
telling them not to hit?
Okay, I'm not sure I heard you or understood you.
Oh, I'm just saying there's a third option again in that whether it hits them or back, is there a conscience that is directed at that moment by the action of
Right.
God within you, also not
Right.
to,
So, what sort of theory one would develop to explain that sort of thing at an interface between the spiritual and the physical, I don't have any conception of. But that doesn't mean that it's not worthy of thinking about. Tom? Sorry.
What's free will? That's what I came for tonight. The servant was going to tell me what free will is.
Well, it wasn't. It didn't promise
The
to.
ability to do something different.
There we. That is. We've had two definitions of free will tonight. One was Harris's definition, which he specified two things, right? That one could have done something different than one actually did, and that one is consciously in control of one's actions, right? So that's one definition we were given. The other one is this one: an agent's capacity to redesign her own character through many instances of responsible action.
The one thing that bothers me about that is the loaded term responsible.
But that's you know, it's you're right. It's certainly a loaded term, but it's one that is a central concept. Actually, it's much more central to the book than is free will. And they define responsible action very carefully and technically, and they describe how they think the neural system achieves it. So you kind of have to read the book to put it in the context they mean it.
I would agree with what he said here, but I don't understand that as free will.
Okay, well, you may have a different...
Because in our discussion, it seems like it's interpreted or implied as a choice.
Right.
Now here, you have the capacity to retrain your brain, and you can deliberately do that.
Right.
That's a choice.
And that is, but that's just one of many choices. So
Okay, well, they make the point that most of what we would consider to be, or at least in their perspective, let's put it that way, in their perspective, most of what we would consider to be free will is in fact what we might call habitual reaction, right? And therefore, that's why they framed their definition of free will in that way, that it is through the shaping of habitual reaction in a conscious kind of way that we alter our behavior in meaningful sorts of ways. And so they have a very strong, in their theoretical model of neural functioning, they have a very strong role for these ingrained responses, you might call them, right? But they say that doesn't mean that we don't have free will. It just means that we have to work to change the nature of those ingrained responses. And they